This week in Westminster, the new Brexit secretary was slapped down by the Prime Minister for saying Britain may leave the EU single market. The new International Trade Secretary called British business fat and lazy. And this morning, the new Foreign Secretary launches a campaign group calling for a hard Brexit in what appears to be an effort to put pressure on the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson calls for the return of control over borders, laws, money and trade from the EU to the UK. Well, a high-profile Leave campaigner and Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan is live now in Basingstoke. And a very good morning to you. Well, let's work through some of those comments. What about Liam Fox? Is he right about British business and them being in dereliction of duty to export more?
I think Liam would accept that he phrased that badly, and which of us hasn't done that at one time or another? I know I certainly have. I suspect even you might have done, Dermot, from time to time, in the course of a basically very good speech, talking about the export opportunities that will now be open to us as a global country engaged with global markets. He, I think, phrased one section in a way that he, I'm sure, regrets now. OK, and you don't think he should have phrased it like that. What about David Davis, then, the Brexit secretary, saying, well, Britain may have to leave the single market, not government policy yet. We're not sure what it is, but do you agree with Mr Davis? I mean, the thing is, in this century, more than 90% of the economic growth is going to come from outside the EU. And the challenge for Britain is to be part of that growth, to be plugged in so that we benefit as Africa, Asia, South America and the other surging parts of the world push ahead. And in order to do that, we can't rely on the EU because we know that the EU is very reluctant to sign trade deals with these parts of the world. It's been talking for 9 years with India, hasn't done anything, refuses to talk to China. And so the huge opportunity for us is to return to being a global maritime merchant country, of course trading with our friends in Europe, but no longer being subject to the external tariffs of the European Union, the customs union, and the regulation of all of our domestic commerce and industry. Of course, we're going to have to meet EU standards when selling to the EU, just like we have to meet Russian standards when we sell to Russia. But no longer will we have to apply burdensome and expensive regulations either to our domestic commerce and industry or to that bit which we sell beyond the EU.
And this characterisation of the debate as soft and hard Brexit, do you think the nature of the results should inform that debate slightly? The 52-48 in favour of Brexit. If it had been 60-40, would that have signalled hard Brexit? This result means something more nuanced?
I mean, I think that's a very fair point. It was a very marginal result. I think that imposes on the winning side an obligation to take very seriously the top concerns of the losing side, both in terms of continued trade with the EU and in terms of continued participation in various research and educational programmes and so on. I think we need to listen to what the 48% want. And I think we should have the closest relationship with the EU compatible with being a sovereign country. Think of it a bit like Canada with the US. Canada also has a federal state on its doorstep. It isn't part of that federation. It makes its own laws. But it has the closest relation in terms of military alliance, security links, trade and so on. And that, I think, should be our model. We want to work very closely with our friends and allies, who are also our suppliers and customers in Europe, but making our own laws.
So is Boris Johnson, is the Foreign Secretary pushing it too far?
No, I think what you just showed Boris there in the clip saying we want control over our own laws, money, democracy. Absolutely, that's what people voted for. Having taken back control, that doesn't mean that we sort of, swan off and don't talk to our friends and neighbours. I think there is a very good case, having taken back jurisdiction, for, in some cases, replicating through treaties as a friend and neighbour, bilaterally, some of the arrangements that we have with our allies in Europe. We're not talking about just having a trade relationship with them. We're going to have continued close intergovernmental cooperation, close military alliance and so on. But it'll be on the basis that Parliament, and therefore we, ultimately decide what happens.
One of the other things Boris Johnson is remembered from the campaign, of course, is standing beside that bus with the £350 million for the NHS on it. Now, it may have come down to £100 million a week, but do you think Theresa May should not have reneged on that?
Well, it's hardly reneging. It wasn't a promise that she made. I mean, I think, by the way, if Boris had been Prime Minister, I think he would have felt morally obliged to honour that. But the essence of a referendum is that you're instructing a government. A referendum isn't a general election. Because we're not used to them, a lot of people struggle with this. If people voted leave, they weren't electing Boris. They were voting to instruct the government to get out of the EU on the best terms we can get, advantageously to ourselves, but also being fair to our friends and allies in Europe. That is going to free up a lot of the money that we're currently paying to Brussels. But how we now spend that money, of course, will be a question for the British people in Parliament.
Now, let me ask you, we've had discussions before, haven't we, Mr. Hannan, about the nature of the trade deals, and you feel that a free trade arrangement, a quick one from the UK, would be one of the best ways to go. I've just been talking to a very experienced trade negotiator, Michael Johnson, who says, well, he doesn't really believe there is any such thing as free trade, and the downside of that is that some of the activities in the country that does that, the UK, suffer very badly indeed. We're thinking about agriculture here, certain industries, the steel industry, the car industry.
He was right to say that no country in the world has ever pursued pure free trade, because, as he correctly said, there are always vested interests, there are always industries that want protection. However, the countries that have got closest to that ideal, whether it's Switzerland or Hong Kong or Singapore, almost without exception, have been countries that have then grown more quickly, and the standard of living for everybody in that country has tended to rise faster than the countries that retain distortions, protections, and closed markets. So, of course, we're not going to be able to have a kind of pure, perfect, open trade model, because there are going to be distortions here. I've been in politics long enough to know that that's how it happens. But the closer we get to it, the better it will be for everyone. And where there are industries that particularly are going to be affected by the transition. So actually farming is a good example, right? We're in the Common Agricultural Policy now. Outside it, we'll have much cheaper food. It'll be a huge boon for almost every family in the country as groceries come down. But when every other country in the world, every single one except New Zealand, subsidises its farmers, it would be very difficult to say we're going to be the only ones who don't. So what we should do in that situation is simply give a higher direct grant to our farmers than at present, rather than having tariffs, quotas or other trade barriers. That's by far the cheaper and more effective way of doing it.
And lastly, Mr. Hannan, may I ask you about, I think what we'd all agree would be a very unwelcome dimension of the Brexit vote. I mean, do you feel there has been an increase in hate crimes involving foreign nationals in the UK?
I mean, you phrased the question there as though it was a given, because you called it an unwelcome consequence. I don't accept that. And I think it's a tendentious thing to put the question in the way that you do. There has been, for a long period, a rise in the reporting of hate crime incidents because of the way in which the police have their websites and treat every report as an incident. There hasn't been any increase in the number of cases referred for prosecution. And some of the cases that the media have jumped on have turned out to have nothing to do with Brexit at all. So there was a huge fuss about those plankton in Newcastle who had to send them all back, repatriation banner. Those idiots have been doing that every weekend outside the town hall in Newcastle for years. It was nothing to do with Brexit. Similarly, there was a case that was supposedly about Brexit-inspired anti-Polish graffiti. It turned out not to have been anything of the kind. So I think there has been some slightly irresponsible reporting of this. Of course, any kind of intolerance, any kind of hateful incident doesn't need, it goes without saying that we all condemn that. But to insult 52% of the British electorate by suggesting that there is some connection between voting to take back our laws and being unpleasant to people who have made their lives here, I think that's an extremely dangerous way of going.